stop biting your tongue. I think a lot of the times it's kind of this imaginary threat. I mean, it's real. There are people whose heads are kind of put on pikes on the edge of town to warn us from, going down the same path and speaking our mind. But that is only effective if we bite our tongues and go, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't say something.
The thing is that they can't take us all out. Just to maybe go back to your Hydra thing as well, is that at some point this will cascade into a torrent that can't be stopped. I mean, there is this kind of, return of the repressed.
Plato once said that those who tell the stories rule society. But what happens when our ability to tell stories is under threat? That is exactly what we're here to talk about today in the concept of the censorship industrial complex, the role that censorship is playing on our democracy, and how we can start to tackle some of these impositions on our ability to speak freely in the digital and offline world. I'm delighted to be joined today by Andrew Lowenthal to discuss this important subject, who's been an integral part of the recent Westminster Declaration, which we'll also talk about during today's episode, which seeks to push back against some of this digital authoritarianism. So we're going to look at some of the things that has given rise to this central censorship industrial complex and look at some of the things that we can do to start to navigate this and get our heads around it, because what was once seemed conspiracy is every single day becoming confirmed fact. And we're going to look at everything in between, from the fact checkers to the latest revelations. So, Andrew, it's absolutely delightful to have you here at such an important time. I believe this is one of the most central issues that we need to be talking about right now.
Great to be here, Dan. I like to think so, but I'm a little bit biased because it's what I happen to be working on.
Yeah, and now you've got a history in digital rights first and foremost, but more recently, you've been on the cutting edge of digital freedom of speech, and you've recently launched LiberNet. You're writing constantly about this on the Network Effect Substack. You've been very heavily involved with the Westminster Declaration. You've worked with Matt Taibbi on the Twitter files. This is clearly an important piece of work that you've engaged in, and at the forefront of this activity. But was there a tipping point for you in the last few years where it suddenly, the alarm bells started to ring? Was there a sudden point or a moment where you thought this is way worse than I first thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was COVID. As you asked me the question, I was thinking back. Was there something 2017, 18, 19, I was definitely getting quite concerned in kind of how kind of progressive politics was changing and the rise of cancel culture, etc. But I was very deep inside those progressive spaces, and I always thought it was a little bit of a fringe thing that was just in this fringe world that I occupied. And then obviously it got bigger and bigger and bigger. But yeah, really the turnkey was COVID, and seeing just how much kind of manipulation and censorship was happening. That was very clear. When we talked about, when Facebook said you can't talk about the idea that the virus could have escaped from a lab. I mean, MySpace, where I came out of, did, essentially nothing. No one wanted to be associated with saying, hey, that's a valid hypothesis and worth investigating. Now it's become really the most prominent hypothesis in terms of the origins of the virus. There's obviously major US departments of, Department of Energy and others who think that this is the most likely hypothesis, but you couldn't touch it. And the space that I came out of was the online freedom of expression world. The work we did was in Asia predominantly, but I was connected to groups all around the world, hundreds of different groups having conferences and festivals and events and workshops constantly around demands for freedom of expression on the internet, often working with people in repressive regimes. We worked in Thailand, we worked in the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, many places where people were constantly fighting off government repression of speech. And then, COVID came around, and, I'm not saying I was at first on board in any way, shape, or form. It definitely took me a little bit longer than I would have liked in hindsight to kind of see that something was not quite right. But then almost even to this day, almost hardly any organizations in the kind of progressive liberal NGO world that I was in have said anything. I mean, Big Brother Watch, which people probably, or some people may know, definitely worth looking at their work. They were one of the absolute very few. There's really, I can count them probably on one hand, the organizations that said and did anything. And even for me internally, even as the executive director of an NGO that I co-founded, it was very difficult to kind of get this across to staff as well. So that was the turnkey. And unfortunately, people are opening up a little bit more, I think, in terms of the conversation now, but it's a very, very long way to go in terms of people who are still inside that bubble.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, you talked about the work in different parts of the world where, people may more frequently associate a lack of democratic process and these kind of fundamental rights and freedoms. Yet now it feels like we're in a time where I describe it as living in the upside down. It's like watching Stranger Things. This question of our freedom of speech is under threat, and people are almost willing. Some people are willingly cheering that on, and there's certainly, as we'll talk about, organizations and individuals driving that along.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think public perception around this has changed? Why do you think it's become something that people are increasingly supporting? People are going as far as arguing that it's to protect democracy. What's your take on that?
Well, the internet is certainly not the beautiful place that people envisaged back in the web back in the 90s. As the hoi polloi have gotten online, people have brought with them all of their faults and things that maybe they get wrong, and coarse language, and et cetera, and there are bad actors in there as well. I think the people who originally envisaged this idea, sitting in ivory towers and NGOs and philanthropies, et cetera, imagined that the internet was just going to become full of other people who were just like them, whereas actually that was a very, very silly idea. Of course, the internet was never going to scale in that way. And I think, a lot of everyday people got online, and elites panicked and went, wait, this is not what we meant when we said free expression. We only meant free expression for ideas that we like. Which, well, I don't think, obviously they didn't say that out loud, but that's essentially what their actions ended up saying, speaking much louder than their words. So the internet is extremely messy. There's problems online. I'm definitely not going to pretend that there is disinformation. There is hate speech. There's a whole manner of different things. The difference is that, one, there used to be a philosophy that was mainstream until probably Trump and Brexit, that the way to counter this was through more and better speech and through conversation and education, etc., rather than through censorship. And I think post-Trump Brexit, people went, well, that's just not going to work. We're just going to have to go top down and authoritarian in terms of fixing this problem. And then COVID just took it to the next level. I mean, if you find a speech online from Hillary Clinton, I think it's from 2010, she has this famous internet freedom speech where she essentially kind of has the line that we would probably have today, which is, yes, there are bad actors. Yes, there's like bad content. Yes, there's extremely problematic things online, but we must preserve freedom of speech. It is still the most fundamental freedom. I mean, everyone, Jacinda Ardern is probably the kind of new Hillary Clinton in that sense, in terms of encapsulating the new ideology, which is this kind of be kind authoritarianism, essentially. That is, well, we're going to make the internet nice whether you like it or not. And that has been a failure, I think, spectacularly, particularly during COVID, but on other issues as well.
You mentioned kind of its origins and, protecting certain viewpoints and narratives, I suppose. Do you think this is potentially why this is now considered somewhat of a partisan issue? Do you think it is a partisan issue in the way that people have responded to this?
Somewhat. I mean, the other thing is, and what we saw through the Twitter files, is there is a huge amount of inorganic activity around this as well. So yes, there's this kind of zeitgeist that was pushing in this direction, but there's also very clearly state actors who have kind of leveraged and advanced also some of this thinking because it is advantageous to them. So there's a very new story out on Racket just a couple of days ago that I wasn't involved in, looking at the Center for Countering Digital Hate and its origins inside the centrist wing of the Labour Party, and this kind of cynical use of kind of countering disinformation, countering hate speech, etc., essentially to neutralize political opponents. And that is essentially what has happened with this kind of disinformation work across the board, is that it's been weaponized. Maybe at the start it was well intentioned, but it's become weaponized by very powerful actors to control narratives and advance particular viewpoints and to exclude others. And this was always the fundamental argument around freedom of speech, which is that, okay, if you open the door a crack, there are smart, powerful actors who are going to take advantage of that. And I think people naively thought, well, no, that won't happen. Or they appeared, like they were on, they kind of cloaked themselves in this kind of progressive, liberal kind of language, and they're against hate speech and for diversity, etc. But through that mechanism, they also kind of built this new, essentially, well, what came to be named the censorship industrial complex. And it is really, having done a lot of the research around it, it is a complex at an industrial scale. It's enormous what was going, or what is still going on.
Yeah, so this term censorship industrial complex has become commonplace in the marketplace of ideas now. At least it's got a point of recognition. It's got a label, and sometimes when we have a label for something, it brings greater understanding. We can see things in a different light. But for people who are new to this idea, this new complex, this industrial complex, could you kind of outline in your terms what you believe this is? And then I'd like to explore further, some of the mechanics that are involved in its operation.
Sure. Well, I'm not necessarily, censorship industrial complex for me doesn't necessarily suggest that there's kind of one centralized kind of hub that is doing this. But, what we found looking at the Twitter files and then doing further research individually on some of the more prominent so-called anti-disinformation organizations is essentially a network of several dozen very prominent NGOs, but hundreds more that exist in this kind of anti-disinformation field. Philanthropists, media organizations, big tech, huge amounts of government money, academic institutions are extremely prominent around all of this work. There are a range of different consultancies, think tanks like the Aspen Institute or the Atlantic Council, and many of these organizations are multi-million-dollar organizations. The Pentagon is giving out grants of almost $1 billion to some of these kind of larger kind of beltway organizations in DC, like Pareton, to do counter disinformation work. So you're talking about huge amounts of money that are going in, hundreds, if not thousands, if not even more, people who are employed around this work, people who are doing it as state actors. There's things like the 77th Brigade in the UK that did, COVID misinformation censorship. Then that was an army unit. So, the conspiracy theories are kind of, increasingly coming to be true in many respects. But I think the main things are, looking at, progressive liberal philanthropy, NGOs, academia, media, big tech, think tanks, and government. They're the main 7 components.
And then what I seem to see is that, the argument that they put forth as a rational basis for their existence is around this idea of online safety. We've just heard the online safety bill, or the online harms bill in the UK, this idea that we're protecting individuals and groups from harmful information online. And as I'm sure we both agree, there is actually harmful information, and we can discuss, where those boundaries should lie, if at all, later on. But do you think that's really what's driving it, or is it bigger than that? Is it about protecting narratives? Is it about protecting interests?
It's much bigger than that. So, I think there's 2 things going on, and there's an overlap. So one is the kind of hate speech angle, and the other one is the disinformation angle. And there's a kind of Venn where, they overlap, where people talk about harmful disinformation and other things. But there's a huge amount of inorganic kind of activity around this, as we were just talking about, say, with the 77th Brigade, or, for example, what has just come out of this House Committee on the Weaponization of Government in the US, whereby it was made clear through emails that something called the Election Integrity Partnership, and then a subsequent initiative called the Virality Project, which was to combat anti-vaccine misinformation, were actually conceived of by the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, there are quotes in there from a think tank called Digital Forensics Labs, which is part of the Atlantic Council, which essentially says, we've been asked to set this up by DHS. And so without, it's there's nothing you can argue there. The smoking gun it's completely clear now. And that work was done at the behest of the government, which is probably illegal. I mean, there are cases that are going through at the moment in the US, where the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, that are saying, essentially this level of coordination between government and academia and big tech, because the kind of censorship coordination was kind of proxied through these kind of university institutes and NGOs, is a massive, First Amendment violation. The partners on these projects never mentioned that it's the inception for this initiative, or these initiatives, was from essentially the security state, but that is what they are. And I mean, there's a whole number of ethical breaches that I can imagine just from kind of a university standpoint, but from a kind of societal standpoint, it's like, what's going on?
Yes.
Like, why even does a Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or whoever, the various partners on these projects, need an intermediary organization? Why can they not manage COVID misinformation on their so-called COVID misinformation on their own? Why is there essentially a coordinated effort? Because these two projects brought together TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, Pinterest, Medium, one or two others that escape me right now, into a coordinated JIRA system, essentially a ticketing system to flag content. And these JIRA tickets were released last week by this House committee that show exactly what was being asked to be taken down, including, say, things like Martin Kulldorff of the Great Barrington Declaration, his tweet that suggested if you'd had COVID or you didn't need to get a vaccine, which was centuries, if not millennia old, kind of medical common sense. And that was, they had flagged this tweet to Twitter. Why do they even exist, I think, is a kind of essentially the large question. So to kind of go back to your initial prompt, is there something else going on? I think most definitely. Otherwise, why are these very powerful entities becoming involved in this work? And you can see directly through the tickets that are created that there is essentially an acceptable viewpoint, and there's unacceptable viewpoints, because often the tickets are not, vaccine is going to turn you into a piece of cheese. it's rally for freedom protest, or jokes, or various other things, or there was one that was like I think a TikTok meme of like, give the finger to the vaccine. It's like, well, is that anti-vaccine misinformation? That's just like, people, you're allowed to be against cars, you're allowed to be against buildings, you're allowed to be against anything you like, pretty much, if you want to be. It's not misinformation to do that. So they were absolutely policing narrative, and not, with pieces of policing science. But then they policed the science terribly, and oftentimes were wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the spillover effect is huge, because it's beyond the simple notion of online censorship. It's actually creating it's shutting down the public square of open dialogue and the openness of ideas, and
Yeah.
that's going to have consequences on open science.
Well, as you were saying, I think it's even worse, because what you're destroying is free inquiry. You're actually destroying truth seeking. So you might be wrong. Someone might say something that's wrong. And actually, there was a podcast with Martin Kulldorff a day or two ago that I saw just a clip of, where he was saying, to kind of paraphrase based on what I remember, was, good, someone says something wrong, or makes a claim that he believes is incorrect. He gets to refute it and argue it back and demonstrate why it's wrong, and in the process strengthen his argument, right? And advance the conversation. The idea that we're just going to arrive at, the truth through, I don't know, a small group of experts hanging around Imperial College or wherever it might be, or in the cabinet room. We've learnt over centuries that was not actually the best way to get at the truth, or as close to it as we possibly could. But we've reverted back there. But what is kind of more terrifying is that many people are actually quite happy about this. Many people don't want the messy conversation. And that's the cultural aspect that you were also talking about before. People are actually okay with people kind of coming in, the world is messy, the world is confusing, I'm scared, I don't know what to do, just give me something simple. And I think getting people back out of their comfort zones is going to be one of the most difficult things to do, kind of to stop craving essentially that kind of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost that there's been a void in a vacuum that's allowed it to creep in. There's various cultural elements. I think this slide towards safetyism is one of them. I think my observation, I've spoken about this before in the podcast, is almost like a limited psychological evolution in the digital realm. We're still grappling with, whilst commonplace technologies like mobile phones and the internet, etc., we've had them for a while. We're really in its infancy compared to the history of humanity and modern society. And it feels as, and last night I was at a physical meeting and political subjects were discussed. And, I almost had what I would describe as my Twitter response, which is like this internal, like, oh my gosh, this is going to break out in a really egregious sense of argument in a moment. But actually in the public realm, people were able to hold one another's opinions and perspectives. And they were perspectives. You'd struggle to argue many of these things as hard fact. Although, if they happen in the online space, they may have been struck off by fact checkers as false. But in the digital realm, it seems like we haven't got the psychological maturity to be able to deal with that kind of openness of ideas, the point of debate and rationality and reason that you touched upon. And therefore, we create the space for this kind of deference to authority, whereby they come in and make us safe again and limit the conversation. And I think the safety argument is very limited. It's a situational, contextual argument based around real issues, but it's been extended as a cover for all of these things, as we've touched upon. But it really is, to me, concerning that we are seeing this embraced. And I think when there are narratives to protect and there is interests that underline those things, you can see a clear conflict of interest that will preserve those interests. And whether they're political interests or private interests, what we're seeing, I think, is both a confluence of both private and political interests colliding. And they're realizing that the machinery they share in common, the mechanism, and therefore they're able to shut down the dialogue. My question to you, Andrew, is what do you think is really at stake here if this continues? What's really at stake here?
I mean, a free and open society, I would say. I think it's absolutely fundamental. If we can't have a conversation democratically, then we're not going to have democracy. I mean, these fundamentally anti-democratic initiatives, right? You cannot have democracy without free speech. You're constantly censoring people. You can't have informed consent when you're basically censoring, Harvard epidemiologists on the internet, and you're being given the wrong information. So, even from a safetyist perspective, you're being made less safe through censorship because you're not getting all the information that you need. Again, I think that what you're pointing to a little bit was there's an evolution that needs to happen, that we've got all these tools, we've got all this information, we've got, I'll say too much information, but we don't have our kind of monkey brains are not set up to deal with this much information. And so the kind of shortcut has been, well, let's just kind of be authoritarian. That will be the way that we can kind of get to the truth. But again, actually, we get to something much, much poorer as a result. And so I do think we have to evolve new ways of having the conversation that are going to be very, very functional. And maybe that's, having a whole bunch of different platforms. I think one of the problems at the moment is that everyone is essentially scrapping over half a dozen or a dozen different platforms, and that just doesn't work. These platforms can't be everything. No platform can be everything to everyone. And so I think there's just a scaling problem, that you cannot have 1 billion people, let alone 500 million people, let alone 100 million people, and try and have 12-year-olds on there and have all manner of different people with different backgrounds, with different ideas about how the best way to run the world is. So I think we need to kind of have a kind of renaissance, a kind of new internet renaissance, where we have hundreds or thousands of different platforms that somehow solve the network effects problem, because the reason everyone's going to these centralized platforms is they feel they can get a big audience there, and oftentimes they do, but actually oftentimes it's a very, very small minority that are getting the big audience there. You could easily, if you're only getting 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 people, there are all manner of other platforms that will get you just as many. But who wants, obviously that's uninspiring. It's like, oh, you'll be okay with 2,000 views on your video, don't worry. Everyone of course wants to kind of, is driven by the idea that their ideas might reach more people. But yeah, I think that's the kind of really kind of blocker problem that I see. But I think we have to kind of get out of this situation where we're scrapping over a handful of platforms, and have your G-rated platform. If you want to have a platform that is very, very heavily curated, that doesn't kind of share very much or has very particular perspective, then that's fine. If you want to have your R-rated platform where everything goes and there's no filtering, etc., then let's have that. But we can't kind of combine PG and R together in the same space. It's clearly not working. And so actually oftentimes there are these conversations about actually making Twitter or Facebook or others kind of just common carriers, right, where they kind of should be treated by the telephone lines. Whereas, I've more recently starting to think actually, no, the way to do it is essentially to have kind of anti-monopoly legislation that breaks the companies up, and then, let 1,000 flowers bloom, to briefly quote Mao.
Yeah, well, I believe the revolution will be decentralized, and I think that speaks into that future direction. But I also see the challenges of that perception of the network effect. That's the Silicon Valley has been built upon that. The entire one of the key tenets of a successful investor deck is the network effect of your proposition, and in the absence of solid anti-competition legislation or anti-monopoly legislation. I mean, I remember studying economics during my GCSEs and A-levels in the UK, and they talk about the Monopolies Commission. I'm not even convinced that still exists. And the difficult reality.
It probably does exist, but it's probably there to help form monopolies rather than break them up.
Exactly. It's the upside down. It's actually now enabling them rather than shutting them down. And in the same way that those who are standing up against disinformation are actually propagating it. The challenge here is significant, and the global marketplace is also a very interesting challenge, because what these platforms present is this melting pot of ideas of different cultures, and yet they are treated almost with homogeneity. It's the rules apply, this authoritarian rule goes across the bases, and therefore there's no allowance for cultural differences. There's no allowance for differences in the way that Western culture and Eastern cultures collide. It's a very uniform approach, and I think that in itself is also a dangerous predicament, in the sense that you're not allowing for those differences to we almost start to go towards this minimum, suitable language set that we're able to communicate within, because we might offend outside of that parameter, and that's where this kind of hate speech piece has become problematic.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the kind of reverse of what I was just thinking, whereby instead of kind of this imperial forcing of free speech onto, other cultures, in some ways it's actually going back the other way. Sometimes it's actually more authoritarian, or kind of cultures that are more deferential to authority kind of being integrated back into the Western model, and saying, okay, well, we need to kind of tamp this down and not do this and not do that, etc. Actually, oftentimes what I ended up thinking, particularly during the pandemic, having lived 5 years in Indonesia, I was like, oh, I'm in Indonesia. Like, I know what this is. I thought it was kind of in these particular places where I'd kind of lived and worked, but actually this, Indonesia is, try to single out Indonesia for any Indonesians watching, ranks very highly in terms of corruption, huge amounts of political nepotism, tons of authoritarianism. I mean, that's why there are all these progressive activists there that are funded by Western NGOs doing their work, because there's a lot of work to be done. It's like, oh, okay, this is what has kind of crept into the West. Not to say that there hasn't been corruption in the West before, but there's kind of there's a new next level of corruption, I think, that's going on, and a new kind of amount of game playing that we're not used to. I mean, I remember being shocked the first time. So when I lived in Indonesia, someone said, oh, actually lots of those protesters get paid money to come to the protest. And I was like, what people? And they would go to the villages and they'd hand out, very small amounts of money, like $10, etc. And they'd bus people in, which, people, if you lived in a small village on the edge of Jakarta, was a decent sum of money. They'd bus you in, give you a packed lunch. These different political parties would do this. You kind of run around and pretend to protest for something or another, and then they'd bus you back home. And the next day, a different political party might give you money and kind of bus you in, and you do the same thing. It's the same where there'd also be, you had to have 3 people in a car in order to drive on some of the major roads in Jakarta. And so there would be people literally who'd stand on the edge of the road, like with their thumbs out, I guess. They weren't going anywhere. And you'd basically pay them, a couple of dollars. I never did this, just for the record. A couple of dollars to like go with you 3 or 4 miles, so you could travel down these roads, and then they'd jump out, they'd go back in the other direction for someone else when someone else needed them. So I just started going, oh, okay, this is actually where we've gone. We're in this next level kind of hall of mirrors that actually the good news is a lot of other societies have this level of corruption. They do not end or expire. This is not necessarily a kind of justification that we should have more corruption. It's not entirely the end of the world, but it's also definitely a very, very bad thing. And I think we're in this new kind of level of corruption and nepotism in the West that we haven't seen for quite some time.
Well, your analogy there of paid protesters, I'm sure we're seeing plenty of that in the Western world, actually. That's a whole different conversation. But it reminds me of the kind of fact checkers in the last few years. There's suddenly all of these fact checking organizations, like swarms of fact checkers, surrounding information to, ready to pounce upon anything that challenges a narrative. And it feels like they are all heading in a similar direction. There's certain conversations, certain narratives that are approved narratives by the current economic and global elite, perhaps, or cultural elite. And the fact checkers are there almost to uphold that present viewpoint. And there's very little scrutiny, I think, into this whole industry that has emerged in terms of
Mhm.
its funding sources, its connections to this industrial complex that we're talking about. But
Mhm.
also, I've seen that some people have done some digging into this, and you're kind of looking at some of the people doing the fact checking haven't even left. I'm not saying they're not intelligent; they haven't left, but they haven't left university yet, and they're fact checking. A renowned. They're fact checking their professor potentially. When it's Jay Bhattacharya
Yeah.
getting shut down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, in many ways, that feels similar. It's you've got a swarm of fact checkers that are preserving a
Yeah, that are
certain
basically
narrative
being paid to fact
protect
check on particular, and people know what they're fact checking for in advance. So with the Virality Project, if you look through the tickets, oftentimes they make no reference to why this is kind of should be taken down. Oftentimes they were using CDC guidance, which was frequently wrong. Well, I was going to say in hindsight, but actually in near sight, it was often frequently wrong. Oftentimes these are coming, so for example, in Australia, I did an Australian Twitter files, and what we found there was that this Department of Home Affairs, which is essentially like Department of Homeland Security for Australia, had this thing called the Extremism Division, under which kind of COVID misinformation was policed. And when they would send a kind of, we recommend you review this against your terms of service, Twitter, they would quote a USA Today article or Yahoo News and say, you should take this down because Yahoo News says that this is incorrect. And also, like, what happened to don't we have doctors and epidemiologists inside the Australian government as well? Why are they not? Not that I would think that was that much better, but it's also, Yahoo News, is that really who you're going to go to? But then at the same time, so again, there's this inorganic and organic element to these things, and it's quite hard to work out which is which, because there are the true believers, and again, there is some amount of disinformation, and there actually, I think, is a role for civil society in kind of watching that, but they should be watching the most powerful actors. They should be watching the claims of government. They should be watching the claims of big pharma. They should be watching, PR companies. These are the people with all the means and who are going to have the most impact, whose lies go furthest and widest. That's the role, and that's why I ended up doing kind of NGO work, because I thought we were focused on the big end of town, essentially. But what's happened is that these groups have started policing kind of disinformation street crime rather than disinformation corporate crime. And some of that is deliberate. So, as we said, I just gave you the example of Department of Home Affairs in Australia, part of the kind of security state, Department of Homeland Security in the US, part of the security state who, conceived the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project, 77th Brigade in the UK. So you can kind of go through, and there's a huge amount of state activity going on this. It's all the receipts are there now. At the same time, and this may be even worse, there are a lot of true believers who really think they're doing the Lord's work, going out piously stamping out what they believe to be untruths. And they actually might be the more difficult group to deal with, because they really believe it to the very core of their being. So again, it's hard to disentangle, but one way or the other, it's all gone much, much too far.
Yeah, what do you think some of the other, the fact checkers and, shadow banning and deplatforming, what are some of the mechanisms that the censorship industrial complex are using? What are some of the most common methods, do you think, at this point?
So the ones that you mentioned, shadow banning, sometimes just deplatforming people entirely. Labeling, I actually think, is very, very insidious, because essentially kind of says, oh, this person's a bit of a leper, like you don't be associated with them. That said, I think some of the things like community notes that happen on Twitter are a good thing. We kind of have more of a crowdsourced conversation about something. I mean, obviously people can weaponize that too, but I think it's a kind of better situation than these kind of top-down actors doing that kind of thing. I think one of them is just, this new system of just keeping mum on things. So, the media has been completely mum on this whole censorship apparatus. They just won't even, if the New York Times or the Washington Post or whoever kind of puts an article up about this stuff online, it's essentially, anti-disinformation researchers who are trying to keep us kind of safe and properly informed being attacked by, alt-right conspiracy theorists. It's not, oh, yes, this project was conceived by the security state. They censored Harvard epidemiologists. They censored stories that turned out to be true. They recommended, and the Virality Project has this quote where they literally say to Twitter, well, actually to all the partners on the Virality Project, that they should consider true stories of vaccine side effects as misinformation. I mean, I find that like abhorrent and incredibly disturbing. I mean, imagine if there was a car who's had faulty brakes and, people had kind of been crashing their cars and getting injured. And there was a group that was saying, well, don't let anyone tell their story on the internet about this because it might stop people driving. We wouldn't want that to happen. So we'll just kind of gaslight these people and take their content down, and therefore continue manufacturing these cars with faulty brakes and pretend that none of these accidents are happening. I mean, the kind of ethical depravity of it is astounding.
I mean, that's pretty much the formula for every product in history that has been harmful to society, that is enabled. My wife's mother sadly lost her life due to mesothelioma, which is a rare form of cancer caused by asbestos. It's another great example of a product that was allowed to remain in use for far too long because of narratives that were created to uphold the commercial interest of that product being available. And
the difference now is, so that used to be PR companies and media organizations that were kind of had conflicts of interests, and governments and politicians who were conflicted or serving other interests. What's really different is the people who used to be the watchers, like the NGOs and like the academics, have actually become complicit in this system. And so we've kind of lost, but there's not really any line of defense. The line of defense has become independent podcasts and Substack, right? Because everything else has kind of fallen down or become part of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's damning to me, and even the other, you were talking about the major press. What's most shocking to me to watch is that all of these things, essentially this censorship industrial complex, to me is a huge threat to journalism, full stop, whether it's independent journalism or mainstream journalism. It's okay when the tide is flowing in your direction. And I think that's part of the problem, is that because this has got a general, the river is meandering in a certain direction, those who are also meandering in that direction are somewhat protected by this tide. But as soon as that tide turns, you are then exposed by the very same machinery that you once espoused and promoted. But my concern is about this, how journalistic standards have been so easily dismantled. And you've had the opportunity to work with some incredible journalists like Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, who have been willing to put their necks on the line for these things, and others. The Westminster Declaration, which we'll talk about later, is got a real, and again, beautifully, a very non-partisan selection of journalists and media entities that are coming together beyond those party lines to actually take this fundamental issue, this principled issue, grapple with this issue. But why do you think there's been so little pushback? Is it because of that meandering of the tide that I referred to? Is it that they're caught up in the interests that are flowing within that river, or is there something broader when it comes to journalistic integrity that's kind of eroded during this time?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think everyone's trying to, or many people are trying to work out what that is. I mean, some people will say, well, it's the kind of change in the class structure of journalism, that it used to be much more of a kind of working class profession, and now it draws who is more kind of skeptical of authority, and now it kind of draws from the same, professional managerial class, middle and upper middle class elites, that the same kind of experts in the government and other places are also drawn from. So there is a kind of class alliance issue, which I think is a really, really big one. I also think that a lot of the kind of changes have been beneficial in society of recent times, have been beneficial to that class, as much as people will talk about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. For the most part, the people who have benefited from this have oftentimes people in the middle and upper middle class, and not the working class at all, but elites within diverse communities. Not entirely, and there's obviously been some serious and very important gains, but it tends to serve much more people at the top of society. So I think class allegiance, I mean, I think there's so many attacks that are kind of happening as a result of the zeitgeist on basic conversation, social media breakdown, this kind of crisis of the elites and the kind of elite panic around Trump and Brexit. I mean, you don't censor when you're confident in your argument and in your position, right? It's a cost, right? It takes a lot of work. It looks bad. There can be blowback. There's a lot of money involved. It's a lot of people to coordinate. And this is actually one of the things that's quite fragile about this system, this complex, is it involves a lot of different people doing a lot of different work, and they have to do a lot of their work in public, right? So you can kind of see obviously a lot of the stuff is behind the scenes, and we only know a lot of that because of the Twitter files and because of other investigations like this House committee or Missouri versus Biden and a few other investigations. We probably know a lot more if there are more investigative journalists out there. But a lot of it is there to see. You can see when people are censored because you can't see the content. The content comes down. I mean, not so much when it's shadow banned, but it's maybe not always as explicit as a story on the front page being blacked out as it was in the olden days. I'm not quite sure where. I've probably only seen that on the movies, but I'm told that it did happen.
Yeah.
But so that's also one of the weaknesses. But to me, it really does point to this crisis of the elites, and the kind of media class are part of these elites as much as they profess to be kind of on the side of the people. They're actually terrified of the people. And I think the kind of corporate class and kind of corporations and government have made a new alliance, essentially kind of cloaking things in kind of progressive language, because it's allowed them to hide much of their malfeasance. And I think many on the left have made a kind of Faustian bargain with that I think is going to come back and bite them, and I think is coming back to bite them now with around the kind of Israel-Gaza issue as well, where you see progressives, I kind of hesitate to say that because some of the stuff that's being supported doesn't look terribly progressive to me, kind of going, oh wait, there's some shadow banning and censoring and other things that I feel are happening to my pro-Palestine content. And so now they've a little bit more, I'm going to say we, I'm just in the kind of some kind of political homeless camp
yes.
at the moment, but I was in the left, and sometimes I still consider myself to be there, and other times I'm just like, who am I? Probably in one of more of those moments right now. And so, I mean, shoes on the other foot. And, sometimes people really just want to learn the hard way. And so maybe that's going to be a bit of a wake-up call to people to go, okay, actually, I should be, more skeptical of these kind of government initiatives to kind of collaborate with big tech to control narratives, because now it's going against me.
Yeah, I think it's one of those classic, when the boot's on the other foot, you can very much feel the impact of that. And I think it's, in many ways, it's a classic case of until you're affected by something individually, personally, or it affects your family or, your loved ones or your work, you tend to keep a low profile. You don't engage in something that doesn't affect you individually. And
also why we created schools and universities and other things, so we could pass on knowledge and not have to learn everything from scratch every generation. So that's also one of the other problems that's going on, is we just seem intent on learning we've got these terrible memories now that seem to make us more easy to manipulate and make us forget, evergreen values and principles that we need to carry through crises and not throw out at the first opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question. We're actually grappling with that issue right now, and some of our other guest interviews looking at, how we maintain fundamental principles and how, I'm asking the question, why? Why do people deviate from their principles in times of uncertainty or fear or crisis? And
And I can make an argument also that's like, you shouldn't always, if the behavior is really non-adaptive, then you do need to change. Like, you shouldn't be. It's interesting actually. So I lived in Thailand as well, and people would talk about Thais as being bamboo and Burmese as being teak. And the criticism was kind of both ways, in the sense that they would say, well, teak is this very hard wood and it just doesn't budge. And so it's very inflexible. And this was kind of one of the reasons that people would say, oh, this is why Burma was conquered by the British, was because they essentially were like, we're just not going to adapt to this or do anything. Whereas the Thais were bamboo, and they were like, well, we'll go this way, we'll go that way. And they don't get colonized, but they do kind of get rather compromised in terms of the power they have. I mean, you don't want to be one or the other exclusively. You want to be something kind of in the middle that is somewhat adaptive as the situation changes, but not so flexible that you are just constantly compromising who you are. So I think we haven't quite worked out what that is in this new kind of world that we're in.
Yeah, so we had Nick Hudson on the show recently, and he was describing, he made a case that the left and right don't exist, and for a lot of people, it's very hard to grapple with that idea because we've become so identified with these groups. But he made this really interesting argument about a kind of a scale between conservatism or conservation and progressivism. And made the argument that it's situational, and in the same way that you've articulated that you've got the hardwood and you've got the flexible wood, there are circumstances where you want to have a hardwood approach. It's these are things we hold dear, we want to protect or conserve, but we also have times where we need to adapt and change. And it's interesting, over the last few years, a lot of our audience find themselves in a similar group to you, Andrew. I think that they call themselves, well, we've called them as a cohort, the lost left, because they've become alienated from their group because of their certain principles being violated, and they're described now as right wing. It's like, well, no, they're not right wing. They're actually, you could argue that the spectrum has moved so far one way that they look right wing. That's one argument, but in many ways, they're actually trying to protect and conserve some of the things they hold dear. And we have some fun with this with some of my particular friends that are long-term left-wing activists, and so they've become more conservative because they are now trying to conserve free speech. They're trying to conserve fundamental freedoms, and that's a conservation activity. It's not something that you're trying to adapt or progress. It's actually something you're trying to defend and protect, which is a different energy. And that we would all, I think, agree that there are things that we do need to conserve, and there are things we need to progress, and we might have a very different viewpoint on what those things are. But they're energies that are required. And that example brought that thinking up for me, because it's true. And that's why a lot of people on the left, thankfully, have suddenly seen what's going on and have said, hold on a minute, we are throwing away quite a lot here. Do we really want to throw away our fundamental freedoms, rights?
A lot of babies getting thrown out with that bathwater. But I mean, I sometimes say I'm a 2010 leftist. If that, whatever the version was there, I still am on board with the yearbook quite a lot. And I agree that a lot of the frameworks, I mean, it exists in the same way that the legacy media still exists, right? So there's kind of legacy political frameworks of left and right. That doesn't mean that the legacy media is not there. in the same way that there's those legacy frameworks are still there and the people who still operate within them. But there's also something quite new going on as well that doesn't really have a name and isn't defined. And on one level, that's extremely exciting, right? I mean, we're living in a, I don't know, kind of upheaval that happens every 2, 3, 4 generations. Like politically, it's also terrifying.
Yeah.
And most days I'd rather just go back to 2010, and just fight those fights. But on the other side, we get people to either fix it or completely mess it up. So, because I think we're in this kind of, is it once in a century? It could be. It at least feels like once in 50 years, kind of, turning, as some people refer to it as, and that's where we're at. And so, those legacy frameworks are to be referenced to a degree, but the new thing is going to be something a new kind of synthesis of a whole variety of different ingredients that, for me, take us to our values and principles and starts from there, rather than trying to hold on to these legacy frameworks.
I want to turn to talk about the Westminster Declaration and perhaps some of the solutions, because in the course of this conversation, you've referred to the kind of organic and inorganic elements of this. And I forget the name of, I'm looking back to the childhood cartoons I used to watch, and these kind of multi-headed beasts. And it feels, in order to conquer this beast, where do we slice, which head do we slice off so that it's,
right.
I don't,
well, yeah.
I don't think
many-headed Hydra, but I think doesn't it grow back as well?
Yes. Yes.
So I can't even remember the story of how's the Hydra killed in the end.
Well, maybe we just need to go back to those stories to find the answer to this particular predicament.
Someone stabs it through the heart, I presume. But actually, now that you've mentioned it, I need to go and have a look. Or maybe there's just so many people that they all chop their heads off at once and they can't grow back. Anyway, we don't know the story. We should go and look it up. Look, it's going to require a lot of people doing a whole bunch of different things in order to kind of overcome, I think, what I hear Brett Weinstein increasingly calling Goliath, Hydra. I mean, we have these mythologies that we can draw on quite a lot. Again, we're not the first people to ever be in this type of situation. Obviously, there's something very particular and very specific about our moment and this time, but there's so many stories that we can draw from. But the Westminster Declaration is what I would call a kind of free speech manifesto for these new times. So, because particularly focuses on the challenge of the weaponization of mis and disinformation, some amount around the hate speech, but mostly around the weaponization of mis and disinformation, and what has happened to us over the past several years, particularly accelerated by the government and other responses to COVID, to our culture and our society, and how we need to claw back the stuff from the past, and also look towards the future in terms of what does that new synthesis, what does that new configuration, what do those new values and principles look like. And as you said, it's to go back to our legacy frameworks, left and right, in terms of the people who are on there. There's Yanis Varoufakis, there's Slavoj Žižek. At the same time, there's Oliver Stone, he's probably on the left. There's Jordan Peterson, there's Barry Weiss, there's Steven Pinker, there's Jonathan Haidt, there's Tim Robbins. There's people from really across the spectrum in that place. Also, and that was very, very deliberate, because the message that we wanted to send was, this is not a legacy framework issue. This is a kind of fundamental, this is kind of one level lower in the kind of free and open society stack, which is free speech and free expression and free inquiry. And so those people who can see that, we need to go a layer down in the stack and say, we need to kind of have this part of the platform well configured and integrated and in there as part of the firmware, if I keep kind of overusing my metaphor, rather than kind of tinkering it around with it on the software level. That's the message in terms of what we need to do. And I think for me, I think sometimes it seems that people on the right think that winning looks like kind of squashing the left and kind of destroying it, and I don't know, putting everyone on a spaceship into outer space, and you never have to deal with them ever again. I'm not sure what their
I think both sides think that about each other, don't they?
Yeah, maybe. Whereas, because we don't have enough spaceships, my what I think is a better idea is renormalizing free speech and free expression on the left and the right. That's what needs to happen, and that's why you need to go down that kind of layer in the stack. Otherwise, we're just kind of going into this kind of tit for tat. I'll get you, you get me, kind of political competition. And the reason, as much as there were many, many problems in society 20 years ago, we had a fairly widespread acceptance of kind of free speech and expression. And actually more the people who weren't respecting it were the right. Around the Iraq War, if you said anything like, oh, you're attacking the troops or whatever it was that the right would use to kind of try and shut down criticism of the Iraq War. So it kind of goes for everyone. And I think this is what's interesting again about these new times is that, I talk to people that I would never have spoken to 5 years ago, that I would have been like, oh, you're totally from the other side.
Yes.
Like, watch out for you. And they go, actually, we go down a layer. We agree on a whole number of different things. Again, and that's exciting. Again, I'd rather just be in 2010, but cannot time travel, cannot go into space very easily. So we're just going to have to come up with, Earth planetary level solutions at this stage.
Well, yeah, I mean, the signatories you've mentioned, quite frankly, if you put them in a room on any particular topic, it would be a fiery discussion. But their point is they want the ability to have that discussion, to have reason, to hear counter arguments. And that's how you advance ideas. I mean, even going back to my school debate club stuff, didn't have it as significantly as I know they have it in the States. But part of the objective was you, on day one, you argue your point of view. On day two, you have to switch sides and argue the other point of view. And of course, it creates that competitive streak that you want to make the best argument. So you go all in on both sides of the argument. And then the day three is bring the argument you haven't made yet. And it's like, out of the box thinking. But now it's like we're shut down to this like narrow group of thinking.
I imagine you wouldn't even be allowed to do that in a lot of schools.
No chance
these days.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, well, let's have a debate about free speech. I can imagine you're only allowed to have one opinion, or you might offend people on one side or the other. So I think, that conversation is broken down. Again, I don't know why I'm so positive today, but I find so many people want to have this conversation. I will say the thoughts in my head out loud much more now than I did a couple of years ago. And people are like, I can see them, when I speak to people in a room, people like nodding their heads or talking to me afterwards and kind of going, yeah, they really want. So the vast majority of people actually want to have this conversation. And it's actually a kind of small minority of people, inorganic and organic, who are shutting the conversation down. So, those bullies essentially need to be put in their place. But, well, in some ways, yes, but not that they can't participate. Well, the inorganic people definitely shouldn't be allowed to participate because they're cheating, essentially. And the kind of organic bullies basically need to participate in the same way that everyone else is participating and join the conversation and not try and ram their ideas down people's throats.
Yeah, I mean, many times during the last 3 years, it's just felt like many of the issues that have become hyper radicalized or intensified or shut down, either end of the extreme, quite frankly, where it's either taken away or it escalates out of control. It almost feels like the proverbial adult needs to step in and say, wait a minute, break it up and come back down to everyone has the opportunity to speak.
And
You
that
need to
and
listen to
that
each
level
other.
of paternalism would be okay in the sense that that's actually where a parent has a role, right? At the moment, the parental role is saying, "No, you're just going to do what I say."
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas the parental role should actually be like, hey, stop it. Like, let's reset this conversation. I'm using my authority in a positive way to reset the kind of space and the conversation and the atmosphere and the kind of modality of the interactions so that we can start afresh and work together to solve this problem. But instead, the kind of authority is being used, it's been captured essentially, and it just stays there. And it's like, well, because you can't behave, you're just going to do everything that I say.
Yeah, I think that's partly the heart of the problem, and it's even in that context, we should be talking adult to adult relationships. We're not talking adult child relationship here, particularly in the if we're looking at the R-rated spaces, or just the adult spaces. We're dealing with adult to adult relationship. It goes back to that point around psychological development in the online space. People aren't playing the adult role. They're not standing up. And if a fight broke out last night in the pub where this meeting was being held, someone would have intervened. But you can go on Twitter and have a verbal fight, and no one will say anything. No one will intervene and say, well, hang on, let's come back to first principles. And it's like the lost art of personal responsibility as a result of a lot of things we've talked about, which has created the space, it's created this void for this paternalistic or maternalistic. That's the whole argument in itself about what energy is playing the authoritarian card. But in either case, it creates the space for authoritarianism to clamp down with authority.
Yeah. I like what you said there about kind of personal responsibility. That, I mean, this is again when I see when people going, oh yeah, I kind of see that something's a bit off and da-da-da. But very few people say something. I mean, there's a very high cost. I mean, I think that's partly deliberate. The costs have been increased dramatically to kind of raise your hand and say, hey, I'm not so sure about this.
Yes.
It's like, well, you must be a X or a Y. You must be supporting this. Da-da-da. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm just like, well, and then,
that's right.
And you lose all your friends and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's actually have a look at this Center for Countering Digital Hate piece on Racket, not something I was involved with, but I wrote the entry for the Censorship Industrial Complex, a very long piece. It is on Racket, so I spent some time looking at them. And, they essentially are the bully, and they kind of do it so forcefully and aggressively that people just kind of go, oh God, should I say something? Like, that person's being really nasty. But I feel like but essentially if I pop my head up, they're coming for me next. And so I think I'll just be quiet. The thing is that they can't take us all out. Just to maybe go back to your Hydra thing as well, is that at some point this will cascade into a torrent that can't be stopped. I mean, there is this kind of return of the repressed that will happen at some point, and I think they're just staving it off for now, and that's the best that they can do. But it's not actually a resolution to the problem. They're just doing their permacrisis management strategy, but I cannot see how that can last.
Indeed, yeah. So to close out, we've talked about the Westminster Declaration, which I think is a really important piece in the fight back against digital authoritarianism, this censorship industrial complex. What's the hope that document will produce? And am I right in saying it's now been delivered to Rishi Sunak? Has he had a copy of this declaration? What's that? Sorry. No, difficult question. He's gone, or we've been censored. The answer's been the declaration's so powerful that we lost you.
For me, the primary thing is that it is used as a kind of reference point and a tool for others who are trying to kind of expand the kind of conversation around this, or kind of break open the Overton window that people in academia, inside the NGO spaces, inside the media, all the different places where this conversation is going on, can say, hey, well, there's this criticism of this space that is going on, and we need to have a reckoning. around that. So, I mean, that's why, I mean, I very much see it as an evergreen document, in that it's not just kind of pushed out there. We got quite a lot of very good media at the beginning, at the release point, but now it's to put it to work in a whole variety of different contexts. At the same time, there is a kind of plan to, or a conversation that's beginning about what is next in terms of how do we kind of implement, mobilize the values, principles of the Westminster Declaration and the organizations that put it together and the people with whom it has resonated into more widely into society. Because I think, again, as I was saying earlier, it's a very, people are very, very hungry to this conversation. The key is to somehow kind of break open the conversation little by little, and eventually at a much greater scale, so that we renormalize free speech and expression. So it's obviously not a silver bullet. It's not gonna do everything, but it's one significant contribution, I hope, to changing the conversation and changing the norm and giving people a certain amount of confidence and heart to go, okay, I'm not crazy. There's a whole bunch of other people that think something's not right about how we are essentially trying to problem solve societal issues, and also to kind of maximize the opportunities that are presented to us. And
I think the opportunity to democratize those issues is key here. And I know that the Declaration itself has provoked a lot of interest amongst the public, but it's not necessarily open to public signatories. But the question is, to close, is in terms of solutions, what can ordinary people do you think, to resist this kind of trend towards censorship that we've talked about today? What can individuals do to stand for free speech and the principles that we've discussed today?
Exercise it. Stop biting your tongue. I think a lot of the times it's kind of this imaginary threat. I mean, it's real. There are people whose heads are kind of put on pikes on the edge of town to warn us from, going down the same path and speaking our mind. But that is only effective if we bite our tongues and go, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't say something. And I mean, so far for me, so far so good, that I haven't, even though I came very much from this kind of liberal progressive NGO space, I haven't had a huge backlash. And that would often be the question that people would ask me and say, oh, so what happened? Like, to the parts now, I saw your name, like I saw you wrote this thing that was very critical, and I haven't got the bad treatment so far, which didn't say I'm not going to get it at some point, but I think that's just part of the territory. And again, in my mind, we win when there's this kind of oh, captain, my captain moment in Dead Poet Society, where everyone just kind of starts getting up on their desks. So you're looking at me like maybe you haven't seen Dead Poet Society.
No, I haven't seen it.
Go
it's on the list now.
YouTube, where everyone, they kick the teacher out. They basically, Robin Williams gets cancelled at the prep school, and all the, I mean, he does still get cancelled, but all the students basically stand up and say, we're not going to take it. We're going to kind of cascade our resistance together and say no.
I think that's the collective message of saying no. I think is important. Ending on the cancel culture, cancelling cancel culture with cancellation. I'm not sure is the right.
no, cancelling.
But the
standing up.
Yes, standing up, taking action, and I think the kind of metaphor of the bully is played out here, and it does feel like that. Being strong-armed into biting our tongue and closing down these fundamental rights. I think there is a greater and greater awareness of these problems, and I think there is actions that individuals can take. If you've been affected by censorship, or you feel like undue, you've witnessed what's happened, I think we can write to the platforms themselves. We can write to the political system. And as the numbers grow, we'll have greater and greater influence. the sails of this whole thing, the kind of that meandering river I spoke about, will change when the tide changes, and it's up to us to change the tide. And I think that's the important link between politics and culture, is that we shape the culture and the politics will follow. And it's that, at the moment, the tail is wagging the dog, but it's time for the dog to take charge, and it's time for the kids in the class to boot out the teacher. That's where we're at. So I'm with you on that sentiment. I think this is a really important document. It's a landmark document, I think, and it's the credibility of those signatories is really important. And I think each one of those signatories, in my view, now has a responsibility to uphold those principles and live those principles and be role models for those principles. Because I think role modeling what we want to see is part of the change in itself. And having, for those people, as I alluded to, I'm sure we can have very animated debates, and we want to do more of that on our show. We want to bring people together to discuss these ideas, to be to create the frame for what Aubrey Marcus calls united polarity, whereby we can have reverence for one another as human beings, but still acknowledge and still acknowledge one's points of view without having to result in censorship or ad hominem attacks. It's about how do we have healthy discussion, and I think that this is part of the solution, in my view, is how we model that and how we showcase healthy discussion online, because that's where the real problems are. So I'm really excited to see where things go next, Andrew. And you've got some exciting projects that you've lined up with the LiberNet, and your writing on this is impeccable. So for those at home, if you haven't checked out the Westminster Declaration just yet, the link will be there for you in the chat. It's westminsterdeclaration.org. We'll also put the link to Andrew's Substack, which is networkeffects.substack.com. And are there any other links or resources you'd like to share as we close out today's discussion, Andrew?
Those two I would start there.
Fantastic. And strong call to action, live the message, and together we can maintain a free, open, and prosperous society. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your discussion with us today. One of many in the future that we're having on this subject, because it's so important. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you didn't know, we're still suffering censorship today on this show. In fact, we're even suffering censorship on X, formerly known as Twitter. We had written confirmation that we are indeed being suppressed on that channel at the moment, which is seen to be the bastion of free speech. Not for us. So if you haven't yet joined our mailing list, join over 20,000 people who have joined the mailing list in the last 2 weeks at danastingregory.com/pandemic. Add your name to our mailing list so that we can be sure that we can reach you despite what these big tech platforms do. So please do take action. Check out Andrew's Substack. And if you haven't already looked at the Westminster Declaration, it's a vital piece in our armory in this fight back against the, I don't like to say war on free speech. I don't like to use these grand terms, but in many ways it is a battle. And it's a vital tool in the armory in this battle. So please do check out the Westminster Declaration and share it with your nearest and dearest. Thank you once again, Andrew, for being here with us here, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really enjoyed it.